The longhouse fell silent except for the crackling of dying embers in the hearth. Stephen Morales lay motionless on his furs, his breathing deep and measured, every muscle deliberately relaxed. Through barely parted eyelids, he watched the pregnant servant girl move through the shadows, her swollen belly making each step careful and deliberate. Samantha Nguyen believed him asleep, and in this moment of vulnerability, she would reveal her true nature. What she did next would change everything Stephen thought he knew about loyalty, deception, and the woman carrying what might be his child. The serving girl's hands trembled as she reached toward the wooden chest beside his bed, her fingers hovering over the iron lock that protected his most precious possessions. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to remain still, watching through the veil of his lashes as Samantha made her choice. 3 months earlier, the first snows had begun to fall across the fjord when Stephen Morales returned from the failed raid on the Saxon coast. His longship limped into the harbor with half its crew missing and cargo holds empty of the silver and slaves that should have filled them. The other jarls whispered of his misfortune, some claiming the gods had turned their backs on him, others suggesting his leadership had grown weak. Stephen's hall, once filled with the laughter of warriors and the warmth of a dozen hearth fires, now echoed with emptiness. Many of his men had fallen to Saxon swords, others had abandoned him for more successful leaders. The servants who remained did so out of necessity rather than loyalty, their eyes downcast when he passed, their whispers following him like shadows. It was during those dark days that Samantha Nguyen arrived. She came with a group of thralls captured from a monastery raid led by Raymond Alvarez, Stephen's former ally who now commanded twice the ships and men. Raymond had offered the girl as a gesture of goodwill, though Stephen suspected it was more mockery than friendship. She was different from the other slaves, her clothes finer, her bearing proud despite the iron collar around her neck. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Samantha spoke little in those first weeks, performing her duties with quiet efficiency while the other servants watched her with suspicious eyes. She cleaned the hall, tended the fires, and prepared meals with hands that seemed more accustomed to gentler work. Stephen found himself studying her when he thought she wasn't looking, noting the way she carried herself, the intelligence that flickered in her dark eyes when she thought no one was watching. The first sign of her pregnancy appeared as winter deepened. The sickness came upon her suddenly one morning as she served the morning meal, her face turning pale as fresh snow before she rushed outside to empty her stomach. The other servants exchanged knowing glances, their whispers growing louder. In a hall where few secrets remained hidden for long, this one spread like wildfire. Stephen's first instinct was suspicion. Pregnant thralls were common enough, but the timing seemed too convenient. Had Raymond sent her for this purpose? Was the child meant to be a weapon against him, a way to claim blood ties to his lineage? Or perhaps she carried the seed of another man, hoping to pass it off as his own for protection and status. The questions gnawed at him through the long winter nights as he watched her belly grow round beneath her woolen dress. She never spoke of the child's father, never sought him out for comfort or conversation. When the other servants made cruel jokes about her condition, she endured them in silence, her spine straight and her chin raised with a dignity that seemed unbroken by her circumstances. As the months passed, Stephen found himself drawn to observe her more closely. He began to notice things that others missed. The way she saved scraps of food for the kitchen cat, even when her own portions were meager. How she helped the elderly cook carry heavy pots without being asked. The gentle way she spoke to the youngest servants, offering words of comfort when they wept for their lost homes. These small acts of kindness puzzled him. If she was a spy or a schemer, why waste energy on such meaningless gestures? If she sought only to survive and advance her position, why risk the other servants' resentment by showing compassion to the weakest among them? The answer began to reveal itself on a bitter night in late winter when fever struck the hall. 3 of the servants fell ill with a sickness that brought burning heat and violent shaking. The others cowered in fear, crossing themselves and muttering prayers to gods both old and new. They spoke of curses and evil spirits, their superstitions making them useless as caregivers. But Samantha stepped forward without hesitation. Despite her advanced pregnancy, she tended the sick through the night, cooling their fevered brows with wet cloth, forcing broth between their cracked lips and sitting vigil when death seemed near. Stephen watched from the shadows as she worked, her movements careful but determined, her face grave with concentration. When morning came, two of the three had passed through the crisis. The fever broke and they slept peacefully for the first time in days. The third, an old woman who had served Stephen's family since his childhood, died quietly just before dawn. Samantha closed the woman's eyes with gentle fingers and spoke a prayer over her body in a language Stephen didn't recognize. It was then that he realized his assumptions about the servant girl had been wrong. Whatever her origins, whatever secrets she carried, she possessed something rarer than silver or gold. She had a heart that chose compassion over self-preservation, courage over comfort. But knowledge of her character only deepened his confusion about the child she carried. If she was truly as honorable as she appeared, why had she never spoken of its father? Why did she accept the whispers and assumptions without defending herself? The questions multiplied like ravens circling Carry-On, dark and persistent. Spring arrived with the sound of ice breaking in the fjord and the return of ships from distant raids. Stephen's fortunes had not improved over the winter. His remaining warriors grew restless, and several had already approached him about joining other crews. The silver in his strongbox dwindled with each passing day, and he knew that without a successful raid soon, his position would become untenable. It was during this time of uncertainty that Jeffrey Morales, Stephen's younger brother, returned from 2 years of raiding in the eastern seas. Jeffrey brought with him a small crew of loyal men and enough silver to ease some of Stephen's immediate concerns. But he also brought news that turned Stephen's blood to ice water. Jeffrey had spent the previous winter in the court of a Saxon lord, gathering information about coastal defenses and trade routes. During his stay, he had learned of a young noblewoman who had vanished from a monastery near the coast. The woman had been placed there by her family after refusing an arranged marriage, and her disappearance had caused considerable upheaval among the Saxon nobility. The description Jeffrey provided matched Samantha in every detail. The dark hair, the intelligent eyes, the bearing that spoke of noble birth despite her current circumstances. Even her pregnancy aligned with the timeline of her capture. Stephen felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrible clarity. If Samantha was indeed the missing Saxon noblewoman, her presence in his hall was far more dangerous than he had imagined. Saxon lords would pay handsomely for her return, and her family would consider her rescue a matter of honor. But more troubling still was the question of her child's parentage. If she had been with child when captured, the father could be anyone. A Saxon nobleman, a monastery priest, even a common soldier. The implications sent Stephen's mind racing. If the child was Saxon-born, its existence could be used against him by his enemies. They could claim he harbored stolen nobility, that he violated the sacred laws of guest friendship by keeping a high-born woman as a slave. Such accusations could unite his rivals against him and provide justification for attacks on his remaining holdings. But if he revealed what he suspected, if he confronted Samantha with Jeffrey's news, what then? Would she beg for her freedom, promising rewards her family could never deliver? Would she try to escape, taking with her whatever secrets she had learned during her time in his hall? Or would she surprise him once again, as she had so many times before? Stephen decided to test her loyalty in the most direct way possible. He would feign sleep and watch to see what she did when she believed herself unobserved. If she was planning betrayal or escape, if she was searching for information to sell to his enemies, this would reveal her true intentions. He had prepared carefully for this night. The other servants had been sent to their quarters early, and he had dismissed his personal guard with orders not to return until morning. The hall was empty except for himself and Samantha, who remained to bank the fires and prepare for the night. Now, as he lay motionless on his sleeping furs, Stephen watched through barely open eyes as Samantha moved through her evening tasks. She worked with her usual quiet efficiency, her movements careful to avoid making noise that might disturb his rest. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek and the determined set of her jaw. When she finished with the fires, she began to tidy the hall, straightening benches and collecting the wooden cups left from the evening meal. Stephen noticed how she favored her left side. One hand pressed to her lower back, where the weight of the child strained her spine. The baby was due within a month, perhaps less, and the physical toll of her condition was becoming more apparent each day. As she worked, Samantha began to hum softly under her breath. The melody was unfamiliar to Stephen, probably a Saxon song from her childhood, but the sound was hauntingly beautiful in the quiet hall. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying notes of melancholy that spoke of loss and longing. For a moment, Stephen almost forgot his purpose in listening, caught up in the simple pleasure of the music. But then Samantha's movements changed. She glanced toward his sleeping form, her eyes studying his face for any sign of wakefulness. Satisfied that he remained deep in slumber, she moved toward the wooden chest that sat beside his bed. Stephen's pulse quickened as he watched her approach, his muscles tensing despite his efforts to remain relaxed. The chest contained his most valuable possessions, silver arm rings and neck torques, gifts from successful raids and tokens of alliance with other jarls, maps of Saxon coastlines marked with the locations of wealthy monasteries and undefended settlements, letters from other Norse leaders discussing plans for future campaigns. Most dangerous of all, it held the records of his dealings with Saxon merchants who traded information for gold, men whose lives would be forfeit if their treachery was discovered. If Samantha was indeed a Saxon spahman, the contents of that chest would be worth more than her weight in silver to the right buyers. The information could warn her people of planned attacks, expose Norse allies, and provide the intelligence needed to crush Stephen's remaining power base. The lock was strong, but Stephen knew that determined thieves had ways of dealing with such obstacles. Samantha knelt beside the chest with obvious difficulty, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward and slow. Stephen forced himself to breathe steadily, maintaining the illusion of deep sleep while his heart hammered against his ribs. Through his barely parted eyelids, he watched her hands hover over the iron lock, her fingers trembling in the firelight. For a long moment, she remained motionless, staring down at the chest as if wrestling with some internal conflict. Stephen could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched with whatever decision she was trying to make. The silence stretched between them like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Then Samantha reached out, but instead of touching the lock, her hand moved to the small wooden cross that hung from a leather cord around her neck. She clutched it tightly, her lips moving in what Stephen realized was silent prayer. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely at odds with what he had expected to see, that he almost gasped aloud. When her prayer was finished, Samantha's hands moved again. But instead of attempting to open the chest, she began to clean around it, using a soft cloth to wipe away dust and polish the carved wooden surface. Her movements were reverent, almost ceremonial, as if she was tending a sacred object rather than plotting to violate it. Stephen watched in growing confusion as she continued her work. This was not the behavior of a spy or a thief. There was no urgency in her movements, no furtive glances toward the door or windows. She worked with the same quiet dedication she brought to all her tasks, treating his possessions with a respect that seemed to come from genuine feeling, rather than calculated deception. As she cleaned, Samantha began to speak in a voice so soft Stephen had to strain to hear her words. She was talking to herself, or perhaps to the child in her womb, her tone gentle and conversational. "Your father is a good man," she whispered, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "He doesn't know it yet, but he has a kind heart beneath all that warrior's pride. He thinks he's testing me tonight, watching to see if I'll betray his trust. But how can I betray something I've never been given?" Stephen's breath caught in his throat. She knew he was awake, had known all along that he was watching her. The realization sent a chill down his spine even as her words about the child's father echoed in his mind. Was she claiming that he was the father? When had such a thing happened? His memories of the past months contained no intimate encounters with the servant girl, no moments of passion that could have resulted in her condition. Samantha continued speaking, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet hall. "He wonders who fathered you, little one. He thinks perhaps I carry another man's child and seek to deceive him for protection. If only he knew the truth. If only he remembered that night when the fever took him, when he called out in his delirium, and I came to tend him." The words hit Stephen like a physical blow. He did remember being ill, though the details were hazy. It had been early in the winter, not long after Samantha's arrival. The sickness had come upon him suddenly, bringing with it a burning fever, and strange dreams that seemed more real than waking life. He remembered fragments, gentle hands cooling his brow, a soft voice singing lullabies, the comfort of another's presence during the long, dark hours when death seemed to hover at his bedside. But he had assumed it was one of the older servants who had tended him, women who had served his family for years. The idea that it had been Samantha, that something had passed between them during those fevered nights, seemed impossible. Yet as she spoke, more memories began to surface like objects rising from deep water. He remembered reaching out in his delirium, grasping for something solid to anchor him to the world of the living. He remembered finding a hand that held his with surprising strength, fingers that stroked his hair, and whispered words of comfort in the darkness. Most clearly of all, he remembered a moment of perfect clarity when the fever broke. A brief instant when he had looked up to see dark eyes filled with compassion and concern. Had that been Samantha? Had she stayed with him through the worst of his illness, risking her own health to ensure his survival? The possibility sent a wave of emotion through him that he struggled to contain. If it was true, if she had been his caregiver during those vulnerable hours, then the child she carried could indeed be his. But even as the realization dawned, Stephen found himself questioning her motives. Had her care been genuine, or had she seen an opportunity to secure her position by bearing his child? The cynical part of his mind, shaped by years of political maneuvering and betrayal, whispered that even the most convincing performance could hide calculating intent. Samantha seemed to sense his internal struggle, her voice taking on a note of sadness as she continued her quiet monologue. He thinks I might be a spy, sent to steal his secrets and betray his plans. How little he understands of honor, of the vows a woman makes to herself when she chooses to love a man who cannot see her worth. Love, the word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Stephen had not considered that possibility, had not imagined that the quiet servant girl might harbor such feelings for him. In his world, love was a luxury few could afford. Marriages were political alliances, relationships were based on mutual advantage, and emotions were weaknesses to be exploited by enemies. Yet as he watched Samantha's gentle ministrations to his possessions, saw the care with which she tended his hall and his comfort, Stephen began to recognize the signs he had been blind to before. The way she always ensured his favorite foods were prepared just as he liked them. How she mended his clothes with tiny, perfect stitches that would last for years. The protective way she watched him when other Jarls visited, as if she could shield him from their judgment and ambition through sheer force of will. These were not the actions of a spy or a schemer. They were the quiet devotions of a woman who had chosen to give her heart to a man who had never asked for it, never even acknowledged its offering. Samantha finished cleaning around the chest and rose slowly to her feet, one hand pressed to her back for support. She stood for a moment, looking down at Stephen's still form, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then she did something that shocked him more than anything that had come before. She leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, her lips barely brushing his skin, but leaving a warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. It was a gesture of such tenderness, such unguarded affection, that Stephen felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he hadn't even known he had built. "Sleep well, my lord," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Tomorrow I'll tell you the truth about everything, if you're ready to hear it. But tonight, let me give you this one gift of peace." She moved away then, settling herself on the pile of furs that served as her bed near the dying fire. Stephen watched as she arranged herself carefully, accommodating her pregnant belly, and pulled a thin woolen blanket over her shoulders. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of genuine sleep, leaving Stephen alone with his tumultuous thoughts. The test he had devised to reveal her of treachery had instead exposed his own blindness. Far from plotting against him, Samantha had shown a loyalty and devotion that he had never earned, never even recognized. The child she carried was his own, conceived during a time when she had risked everything to save his life, asking nothing in return but the chance to serve him with honor. Stephen lay awake for hours, staring at the smoke-darkened rafters above his head, while his mind wrestled with this new understanding. Everything he thought he knew about the servant girl had been wrong. She was not a spy or a schemer, not a woman seeking advantage through deception. She was exactly what she appeared to be, A woman of honor who had chosen to love him despite having every reason to hate him. The realization brought with it a crushing weight of guilt. How many times had he watched her with suspicion, searching for signs of betrayal that existed only in his own paranoid imagination? How often had he dismissed her gentle care as manipulation, her quiet strength as calculated performance? He had taken her devotion for granted, Ibn Rasid, while questioning her every motive, blind to the gift she offered freely. As dawn approached, Stephen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. When Samantha woke, he would tell her that he knew the truth about the child, about her care during his illness, about the love she had never spoken aloud. More importantly, he would tell her that her feelings were not unrequited, that somewhere in the darkness of his suspicious heart, he had found room for something he had never expected to feel. But first, there was something else he needed to do. Stephen rose quietly from his furs and moved to the wooden chest beside his bed. The iron lock clicked open at his touch, revealing the treasures within. He reached past the silver and the maps, past the letters and the gold, to retrieve a small object wrapped in soft leather. It was a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple band of silver set with a single blue stone. She had worn it every day of her life, and Stephen had kept it safe since her death, waiting for the right woman to wear it. He had thought that day would never come, had convinced himself that his heart was too scarred by loss and betrayal to ever trust again. Now he knew he had been wrong about that too. Stephen returned to his bed and settled back onto the furs, the ring clutched in his palm. When Samantha woke, he would offer it to her not as master to servant, but as man to woman, as the father of her child to the mother who had saved his life. He would ask her to be his wife, his partner, his equal in all things. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to test her loyalty, he had discovered his own capacity for love. In searching for betrayal, he had found devotion. The woman he had suspected of scheming against him had instead been protecting him all along, not just from illness and death, but from the loneliness that had been slowly consuming his soul. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the smoke hole in the roof, Samantha stirred on her bed of furs. Stephen watched as she woke slowly, her hand automatically moving to rest on her swollen belly, checking on the child that grew within. When she sat up and saw him watching her, she showed no surprise, no guilt or fear. She simply smiled, an expression of such warmth and acceptance that Stephen felt his heart skip a beat. "Good morning, my lord," she said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Stephen sat up, the ring still clutched in his hand. "I slept better than I have in months," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Samantha, we need to talk." She nodded, rising carefully to her feet. "I know. I promised you the truth, and you shall have it. But first, let me tend the fire and prepare some food. Important conversations should not be held on empty stomachs." As she moved to stir the coals back to life, Stephen marveled at her calm composure. She showed no anxiety about the revelation to come, no fear of his reaction to whatever she planned to tell him. It was as if she had already made peace with whatever consequences might follow her honesty. When the fire was blazing and bread was warming on the stones beside the hearth, Samantha returned to sit facing Stephen. Her pregnancy made the position awkward, but she managed it with grace. Her hands folded over her belly in a gesture that was both protective and peaceful. "You want to know about the child," she said without preamble. "About who fathered it, and when, and why I never told you the truth." Stephen nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Samantha took a deep breath before beginning her story. "It was during your illness, in the depths of winter. You had been burning with fever for 3 days, and the other servants were afraid to come near you. They whispered that you were cursed, that death spirits had marked you for their own. But I could not stand by and watch you suffer alone." Her voice grew soft with memory as she continued. "I stayed with you through those dark nights, cooling your fever, forcing broth between your lips, holding your hand when the nightmares came. You spoke of many things in your delirium, your fears for the future, your regrets about the past, your loneliness in this great hall surrounded by people who served you but did not truly know you." Stephen felt heat rise in his cheeks as he imagined what secrets he might have revealed in his fevered state. But Samantha's expression held no judgment, only compassion. "On the third night, when we both thought you might not see another dawn, something changed between us. You reached for me in your desperation, and I came to you not as servant to master, but as woman to man. What passed between us was born of tenderness, not passion, of comfort, not conquest. When morning came and your fever broke, I thought perhaps you would remember. But you were so weak, so focused on recovery, that I realized the night had been lost to your memory. She paused, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. When I discovered I carried your child, I faced a choice. I could tell you the truth and risk your disbelief, your anger at what you might see as manipulation. Or I could remain silent and bear whatever consequences came from your ignorance. I chose silence because I believed it was what you needed. You had enough burdens without adding uncertainty about a child you couldn't remember creating. Stephen felt tears prick at his eyes as the full weight of her sacrifice became clear. She had protected him not just from illness, but from the emotional turmoil that the truth might have brought. Even knowing that her silence would lead to suspicion and whispered accusations, she had chosen his peace of mind over her own reputation. "Wait, Aizawa," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you care so much for a man who kept you as a slave, who never showed you kindness or recognition?" Samantha's smile was gentle but sad. "Because I saw who you truly were during those fevered nights. Beneath the warrior's pride and the Jarl's authority, I found a man who was desperately lonely, who carried the weight of responsibility like a stone in his chest. I saw your capacity for love, even though you had forgotten how to use it. And I knew that if I could not free your heart, at least I could guard it until you were ready to reclaim it yourself." Stephen opened his hand, revealing the silver ring that lay in his palm. The blue stone caught the firelight, sending tiny sparks of color dancing across the walls. "This was my mother's ring," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She wore it every day of her life, and when she died, I swore I would only give it to a woman worthy of her memory." Samantha's eyes widened as she understood his meaning, but she made no move to reach for the precious object. "I have been blind," Stephen continued, rising to kneel before her. "I have questioned your loyalty while you demonstrated it daily. I have suspected your motives while you asked for nothing but the chance to serve with honor. I have feared your betrayal while you protected my life and my heart with your own." He held out the ring, his hand trembling slightly. "Samantha Nguyen, will you consent to be my wife? Not because you carry my child, though I am grateful beyond words for that gift. Not because I need an alliance or a political advantage, but because in trying to test your heart, I discovered my own. I love you, and I want to spend whatever years the gods grant me, proving that I am worthy of the devotion you have already shown." For a long moment, Samantha stared at the ring in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I am not the Saxon noblewoman your brother described," she said quietly. "That much of your suspicions was correct. But I was not sent as a spy or planted as a trap. I was simply in the wrong place when the raiders came. A woman whose only crime was refusing a marriage my family had arranged. When they took me, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I would find love in captivity, hope in servitude." She reached out with trembling fingers to touch the ring, her eyes never leaving Stephen's face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will be your wife if you truly mean it. If you can accept a woman who brings no dowry but her heart, no alliance but her loyalty." Stephen slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been made for her hand. Then he leaned forward to kiss her, a gentle press of lips that sealed their commitment to each other and to the child they had created together. When they broke apart, Samantha rested her forehead against his, her hand covering the ring as if to assure herself it was real. "What will the others say?" she asked. "Your warriors, the other Jarls. They will not understand why you chose a former slave over a woman of noble birth." Stephen's jaw tightened with determination. "Let them say what they will. I have learned that true nobility comes not from bloodlines, but from character, not from titles, but from actions. You have shown more honor in your service than most queens display on their thrones. Any who question my choice will answer to me." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside the hall. Stephen rose and helped Samantha to her feet, his arm around her waist in a gesture of protection and possession. The doors opened to admit Jeffrey Morales, followed by several of Stephen's remaining warriors. Jeffrey's eyes immediately went to Samantha, taking in her proximity to Stephen and the silver ring that now adorned her finger. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that might have been approval. "Brother," Jeffrey said with a slight bow, "I see you have news to share." Stephen's voice carried clearly through the hall as he made his announcement. "This woman, Samantha, has consented to be my wife. She carries my child and has my heart. Any who would serve me must show her the respect due to their lady." The warriors exchanged glances, some surprised, others nodding as if pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. It was Raymond Alvarez, Stephen's former rival who had arrived with Jeffrey's group, who spoke first. "The Jarl chooses well," Raymond said, stepping forward to offer a respectful bow to Samantha. "I have heard tales of her courage during the fever sickness, of her kindness to the servants. A leader's worth is often measured by those who choose to follow him, but sometimes it is better judged by those he chooses to protect." The endorsement from Raymond, unexpected but clearly sincere, seemed to settle any doubts the other warriors might have harbored. One by one they offered their congratulations and pledges of loyalty to their new lady. Samantha accepted their homage with grace, her natural dignity shining through despite her humble origins. As the morning progressed and news of the marriage spread through the settlement, Stephen found himself amazed by the transformation in his hall. Servants who had worked in sullen silence now moved with purpose and pride. Warriors who had been considering departure spoke instead of the coming campaign season and their plans to win glory under Stephen's banner. The change was not merely in their circumstances, Stephen realized, but in himself. The suspicion and paranoia that had poisoned his relationships had lifted like fog before the sun. In choosing to trust Samantha, in opening his heart to love, he had rediscovered the leader he had once been. His people responded to that transformation, rallying to a man who no longer ruled through fear, but through the strength that came from having something precious to protect. 3 weeks later, as the spring thaw filled the fjord with the sound of running water, Samantha went into labor. Stephen paced the length of his hall like a caged wolf, while the women attended to his wife, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of childbirth. When the cry of a newborn finally pierced the air, he felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. Jeffrey emerged from the birthing chamber with a grin that could have lit the darkest night. "You have a son, brother, a strong, healthy boy who already has his father's lungs." Stephen rushed to Samantha's side, finding her exhausted but radiant, cradling their child against her breast. The baby was perfect, with dark hair like his mother's, and the strong features that marked him as Stephen's son. When Samantha placed the infant in Stephen's arms, he felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took his breath away. "What shall we call him?" Samantha asked, her voice soft with exhaustion and wonder. Stephen looked down at his son, this perfect fusion of their two hearts, and knew there could be only one answer. "Tyler," he said, "Tyler Nguyen Morales. He will carry both our names, as he carries both our hopes." Samantha's smile was brighter than the spring sun streaming through the hall's windows. "Tyler," she repeated, testing the sound. "Yes, it suits him. He will be strong like his father, but gentle like his mother hoped to teach him to be." As Stephen held his son and watched his wife recover her strength, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. A test designed to expose treachery had instead revealed love. Suspicion had given way to trust, fear to hope, loneliness to the deep satisfaction of belonging to something larger than oneself. The child stirred in his arms, tiny fists waving as if already reaching for the world beyond the safety of his parents' embrace. Stephen saw his own future reflected in those small features, a legacy that would outlast silver and ships, raids and political alliances. This boy would grow up knowing love, not as weakness, but as the greatest strength a man could possess. Outside the hall, Stephen could hear the sounds of his people preparing for the day's work. Ships were being readied for the coming season, weapons sharpened, alliances negotiated. The business of survival and prosperity continued as it always had, but now it carried new meaning. Stephen was no longer fighting merely to maintain his position or satisfy his ambitions. He was building something that would endure, creating a legacy worthy of the woman who had saved his life and the child who represented their shared future. As the days passed and Samantha regained her strength, she took her place beside Stephen as his equal partner in all things. She proved as skilled at managing the household and mediating disputes as she had been at tending the sick and caring for the servants. The other Jarl's wives, initially skeptical of her humble origins, soon came to respect her wisdom and seek her counsel. The test that had begun in suspicion and fear had transformed into something neither Stephen nor Samantha could have imagined. Their marriage became a symbol of hope for others in their community, proof that love could transcend the boundaries of birth and circumstance. Former slaves found new dignity in their work, knowing that their lady understood their struggles. Warriors fought with greater courage, knowing they served a leader who valued loyalty over lineage. Stephen's fortunes began to turn as well. Ships that had avoided his harbor now sought him out, drawn by reports of his restored leadership and the stability of his household. The successful raids that had eluded him through the dark winter months now came with increasing frequency, filling his coffers and enhancing his reputation throughout the Norse lands. But it was not gold or glory that marked Stephen's true success. It was the quiet moments in the evening when he would find Samantha nursing their son by the fire, her voice soft as she sang the lullabies that had once comforted Stephen in his fevered delirium. It was the way she would look up at his approach, her face lighting with a joy that no amount of silver could purchase. One evening, as they sat together watching Tyler sleep in his carved wooden cradle, Samantha spoke of the future with a certainty that surprised Stephen. "He will be a great leader someday," she said, her fingers tracing the soft curve of their son's cheek. "But not because he was born to rule, as because he will understand that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. That real power lies in lifting others up rather than holding them down." Stephen nodded, understanding that she was describing not just their hopes for Tyler, but the lessons they had both learned through their unlikely journey to love. "He will know that honor is not inherited but earned," he added. "That loyalty freely given is worth more than obedience compelled by force." As if sensing their conversation, Tyler stirred in his sleep, one small hand reaching toward the sound of their voices. Stephen reached out to touch those tiny fingers, marveling at their perfect formation, their promise of strength to come. The child who had been conceived in tenderness during the darkest hours of winter had become the light that illuminated their path forward. In testing Samantha's loyalty, Stephen had discovered his own capacity for trust. In questioning her motives, he had learned to recognize genuine love when it was offered without conditions or expectations. The hall around them buzzed with the quiet activity of a household at peace with itself. Servants moved through their tasks with purpose rather than mere duty. Warriors shared stories and planned future adventures, and the sound of laughter echoed from the corners where children played and elders shared their wisdom. It was everything Stephen had never dared to hope for, built on the foundation of a love he had almost missed through his own blindness and fear. The woman he had suspected of betrayal had instead become his salvation. The child he had questioned had become his greatest treasure, and the test he had devised to expose deception had instead revealed the truth that would define the rest of his life. As the fire burned low and the hall settled into the peaceful rhythms of evening, Stephen reflected on the strange turns that fate had taken. He had begun as a failed Jarl, suspicious of everyone around him, convinced that betrayal lurked behind every gesture of kindness. He had ended as a man transformed by love, surrounded by family and followers who served him not from fear, but from genuine respect and affection. The test had revealed more than he had ever imagined possible. Not just Samantha's loyalty, but his own capacity for growth. Not just her love, but his ability to recognize and return it. Not just the truth about their child's parentage, but the deeper truth about what made a family, a community, a life worth living. In the years that followed, Stephen would face many more tests. Political challenges from rival Jarls, economic pressures from failed harvests and unsuccessful raids, personal struggles as he learned to balance his roles as husband, father, and leader. But he would never again face them alone, and he would never again doubt the power of love to transform even the most hardened heart. The story of Stephen and Samantha became legend in their community, told around fires on long winter nights as an example of how the gods sometimes disguise their greatest gifts as their harshest trials. Children grew up hearing how a test designed to expose treachery had instead revealed the deepest truths about loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage required to love without reservation. But for Stephen and Samantha themselves, the story was simpler and more profound. It was the tale of two people who had found each other across the barriers of circumstance and suspicion, who had chosen trust over fear, love over loneliness, hope over despair. It was the story of a test that had changed not just their understanding of each other, but their understanding of themselves. As Stephen watched his wife and son sleep peacefully beside the dying fire, he offered a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever gods or fates had brought them together. The test he had devised to protect himself from betrayal had instead opened his heart to the greatest treasure he would ever possess, a love that had transformed his life and would echo through generations yet to come. The rich Viking who had pretended to sleep to test his pregnant servant had awakened to discover that the greatest wealth was not gold or silver, but the devotion of a woman who had chosen to love him despite having every reason to hate him. In trying to expose her deception, he had instead been forced to confront his own. The test had ended not with the revelation of treachery, but with the recognition of a love so pure and selfless that it had the power to redeem even the most cynical heart.